Welcome to Tales from the Bridge. We have a fantastic guest on the show today. Neil Clarke is here. Neil is a little bit of a superstar in the science fiction world. He's been publishing short stories with Clarke's World magazine for many, many years, almost 20 actually. Check out the show notes for a link to Clarke's World magazine. This is a really insightful episode, so we hope you enjoy this one. Thank you for joining us, Neil. Thank you, listeners, for joining us. If you haven't subscribed or left a review or rated the show, please consider doing so. It really helps us out. We'd love to hear from you. All right, let's make our way over to the bridge.
Neil Clarke is a beloved member of the science fiction community. Most will know him as editor-in-chief of the award-winning science fiction and fantasy magazine Clarke's World. He is also the editor of Forever magazine and has published several short fiction anthologies, including 8 volumes in the series Best Science Fiction of the Year, volumes 1 through 8. He is a 3-time winner of the Hugo Award for Best Editor, short form, and it should be noted that he was a finalist an additional 10 times. He was also the 2024 winner of the Locust Award for Best Editor. His latest volume in the Best Science Fiction of the Year series was published in September of 2024, and we're so happy to have Neil. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Great. So how are you doing?
Cold. It's frigid here in New Jersey, but otherwise fine.
Yeah, you tell me about it. It's pretty frigid here in Guelph, Ontario as well. Let me tell you.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, I got to start out by saying congrats on all the awards in 2024, a Hugo and a Locust. How does that feel?
Incredible. Yeah, it's not one of those things you think will ever happen to you. So it's surreal at best.
Yeah, I mean seems like that Locust was your first, and that was for Best Editor overall. That must have been quite the experience.
That was very surprising because there's only been 3 other people who've ever won that award, and so I was used to losing it.
So maybe it makes sense for us to start off to talk a bit about Clarke's World. For our listeners who don't know, it's a curated compendium of freely available but reader-supported science fiction and fantasy short stories. It's available on clarksworldmagazine.com. Can you talk a bit more about it? Like if you're talking to listeners who have not experienced it before, what is Clarke's World magazine?
Well, it started as an online magazine, which just meant that the short stories that we're publishing were just published online. But we also have a print edition. We podcast all of the stories. They're available in ebooks and print issues and all of that. So we're very much like any other magazine at this point, in except for the fact that we're really tiny and we're not paid very well.
Yeah, well, it sounds like that. I mean, talk a bit about that payment because you do hard work and as an editor and as a publisher, how do you support this good work?
Well, so in my work on Best Science Fiction of the Year, I know that there are about 130 to 140 science fiction fantasy magazines out there. Only 3 of them have full-time staff. Those would be Asimov's, Analog, and FNSF. And they've been around for ages, going back well before the digital era. So of the digital era publications, none of us are actually earning enough to have a full-time income from it. I'm doing better than a lot of them. We've been publishing since 2006, and we've been trying really hard to encourage people to actually subscribe so we can keep going. And we've done reasonably well at that. So I would say that I'm part-time salaried at this salary at this point. But because when stuff is online for free, it's hard to get people to pay for it. So we have what we sort of call a pay for convenience business model. You want an ebook, you're going to pay for that. We're not giving it to you. And and then there's also the people that legitimately want to see us keep going, and they support us sometimes for no reward at all, just the fact that we get to keep going. And that's fairly common. Well, aside from the fact that I'm part-time, most of the editors in our field right now are not paid. The authors are all getting paid for the most part. If they're there are a few no pay magazines, but There's a lot of them that pay the SIFWA rate, and SIFWA is the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association, and they have a minimum recommended rate, and all the authors, normally look for that as a minimum. We pay above. I think the rate right now is 8 cents a word. So when you hear about somebody selling short fiction, they're probably getting 8 cents a word for that story. We pay 14 cents because we don't think that 8 cents is enough for that kind of work. And so we have a very distributed business where basically right now every new subscription that comes in, the money spreads out across everything. So we just went from 12 to 14 cents because we hit a new milestone. And the next one will pay the staff a little more until we get there.
So you're, in essence, if you become a subscriber of Clarkesworld Magazine or Patreon supporter, those funds are being distributed to authors.
Authors and the staff.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Interesting. And you're paying more than the going rate. So that's pretty good. And from a reader perspective, what type of things are we going to find there?
So we will consider science fiction and fantasy. We publish mostly science fiction short stories, between 1,000 words in length and 22,000 words in length. So we cover short stories, novelettes, and novellas, short novellas at least. So you'll find mostly science fiction. We do a lot of, we cast a very broad net trying to bring in people you may never have heard of. So they might be first-time authors. They might be, we do a lot of work with translations. So you may encounter works translated from, well, the next issue I'll have one from Chinese and Spanish. So, and we also have authors that everybody knows as well. So, we've had a few of them win various awards, become very well known that route, or just come up through the ranks as short story writers, and people love that stuff. So I know I'm a huge short fiction fan. I've been reading short stories for over 40 years at this point, and this is not where I expected to be, but it's been an interesting journey.
Neil, on that note of short versus long form fiction, I wanted to ask too, you were talking about the financial model. Was that sci-fi magazines and publications that you were speaking to specifically, or is that sort of across the board with all genres and, all literary styles? Well, I'll let you answer that first,
Mhm.
and then I'll get you hit you with part B.
All right, so I'm talking mostly about short fiction in science fiction and fantasy. Each genre has its own norms. So in literary fiction, you might actually have to pay to submit a story to one of those magazines. We don't have that in science fiction and fantasy for the most part. It's considered bad form to charge the authors. The money should always be going out to them. According to Yogg's law is what we call it. Money flows to the author. So yeah, it's unique to us, and that per word rate and stuff like that doesn't carry into the novel area, or anything into books really, because some novellas are being published as standalone books these days.
And on top of the financial, I wanted to ask too about that relationship between short form and long form. Do you see, is it a ladder that people are climbing, from short form to, long form in sci-fi, and is it the same in literary as far as you can tell?
I don't know the literary side so much, but within science fiction and fantasy, short fiction is one of the major gateways for new authors. Um, when you're publishing short fiction, you can take risks. You can work with somebody new. You can take a chance on an out there story, something that pushes the edges of what you would take, or even the genre itself. When you're publishing a novel, you have to invest a lot more money and time. So the novel publishers don't get to do that as often. So there are some people who go straight into novels because not everyone can write short stories. But a number of them start with short fiction and get noticed, get some recognition, find an agent, and sell a novel then. So it is, I like to say it's the lab, the secret, the mad scientist lab of the genre, because it's where all the crazy things happen. It's, where we try all the different stuff that you couldn't get away with doing books.
Yeah, if you look at the list of folks who have published in Clark's World is a pretty extensive and impressive list of authors, of known authors, but also new authors, right? Folks that we have not seen before. Last week we actually spoke with Ben Berman Gaughan, who I think has published a few short fiction in Clark's World, and he's writing. I think his first or one of his first novels. So speaking of the Gateway, he's a quintessential example of that, and he's an interesting guy with some really experimental work that I thought was great. And you have a lot of that. So talk to me about the new authors that you find. Like, how do you make a determination as to who you publish and who you don't? That's got to be really tricky.
Okay, so we rely on open submissions, which means anybody can send us a story. That's got some downsides in the current AI world. But presently, we're getting about 1,000 to 1,100 submissions, legitimate submissions a month. And I have to say legitimate thanks to AI. The From that, we read all of them and we pick the ones we like, and we'll go into a little bit more a deeper reading on those stories, kick the tires, pull the strings, see what falls apart, what shines, and then we'll decide from that which ones we want to publish. Um, and so we tend not to have much more than 2 months of inventory in hand at any given time, despite the number of submissions we're getting. We're highly selective. But despite that, we still managed to find, I think, 9 first-time authors last year, and less than half of the people that we published were people we had published previously. And some of that is that whole churn in the industry, where so someone like Ben goes to write a novel. Well, what's he going to have less time for then? Short stories. And then there's always more authors coming into the field then to fill up that spot that would be freed up. So there's a certain churn that goes on that keeps it different every day, which is one of the things I love about it. You never get bored. And if you want to know where science fiction is going, in 5 years, the people you're seeing in the magazines, the types of stories they're writing, the names, all of that, you're going to see that 5 years down the line.
On top of the business, Neil, I also wanted to talk creative as well too, but personally creative with you. What was your why sci-fi and fantasy? What was your gateway? Was this something that, like many of us, was sparked by a certain book or film or TV show in your youth, or how did you land on sci-fi as your chosen path?
It started when my cousin, who was about 10 years older than me, gave me 3 science fiction books. I was 10 years old at the time, so keep this in mind when I name them. One was The Hobbit. The next one was Stranger in a Strange Land, which again, 10 years old. And then he also gave me a Golden Age anthology, Adventures in, I'm going to get this wrong, probably Space and Time, or Time and Space. I keep flipping it, by Helian McComas. It is one of the defining anthologies of that time period. And that was already old by the time that he gave it to me. But this was around 76 and I fell in love with science fiction from those 3 books. Particularly the short stories were very appealing to me. I lived in walking distance of the local library. It had a very tiny science fiction section, which I proceeded to just mow through. I would ride my bike to the used bookstore a town away and bring $1 and get 10 books, and spend my time like that. It was something that was an escape for me. It was like many in of my age in science fiction. School was not a kind place. I was a small kid, smart, and that made me a target. So getting to escape to another planet, that was my parents would argue that my gateway to science fiction was Lost in Space, because I wanted to be Will Robinson, because who wouldn't want a robot like that?
Yeah, I think for a lot of us, science fiction is escapism for sure. I am thinking about that. Like, you're in such a privileged place right now to be able to read all these incoming stories that are being submitted to you. At least, I mean, those of us who don't have to read 1,000 of them a month, see it as a privileged place to be. But you must see you must see themes kind of emerging. You mentioned that a lot of the stuff you see, the authors are perhaps 5 years ahead of what becomes more mainstream. Do you also see that with themes of stories and like sci-fi tropes? Do you see things earlier than when things become more mainstream?
Sometimes, but the thing with tropes is they tend to stay solid for quite some time. For example, right now, the ones that are dominant are the ones that have been dominant for a while. The only break we've had in the last 10 years was pandemic stories, and I wonder what caused that. Um, but the two dominant themes that we see in submissions are AI, which has just gotten even more prominent in the last 2 years, and climate.
Of course. And but are they shifting in tone or is it pretty static?
Well, they slowly turn.
Okay.
Everything is influenced by events, culture, whatever. Um, and you can see that when you step back from the slush pile. But it's like moving a battleship. It takes the genre a while to turn. There hasn't been many breakout new types of stories done in recent history. You have a lot of re-exploring old ideas in just different ways, which can be just as entertaining.
I remember growing up to where I could go to the used bookstore or even new bookstore to grab an anthology of, with that was published in the 90s with Ursula Le Guin and still Silverberg and Asimov. Um, that's not happening anymore. Are the authors that are writing novels, I mean, we get some of them that are going to novellas, but are you getting submissions from the biggest authors in science fiction giving you short stories?
Sometimes, if they were writing short stories originally, they'll still drop back into some of the markets that supported them earlier, and try and get a broader audience. So there's the current trend. 30 years ago, the trend was you sort of became a house author. If you got a story published by Asimov's, everything you sent went to Asimov's first. Nowadays, it's more they're thinking more in terms of go broad. So they'll sell a story to me, and then they'll say, well, th this other magazine has a different audience that I can have my work exposed to, because a lot of the marketing has shifted with publishing, like away from the publisher. They're all saying, oh, lean on social media, build this, do that. They're not really investing in the marketing on the authors anymore. So they have to work harder to build that audience so that when they try to sell a novel, they can say, well, I've been published here, 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 and all these people follow me and blah, blah, blah. So it it's changed in that way. But I
Right.
think what you were saying about anthologies is very true, that the major publishers have dropped the ball on doing anthologies. They just don't want to do them because they can't make enough money off of them. And these companies are largely run by accountants.
Yeah.
They make the final decision on what gets published to some degree. They need to believe that they can sell it and make a decent amount of money. So the small press is really where the short fiction is these days, and you'll see a lot of Kickstarter campaigns for anthologies. You'll see a lot of magazines, a lot more magazines than you did 10, 20 years ago. Um, and so the market sort of adjusts itself because there's people who are writing this stuff more than ever, and people who want to read it. So there's going somebody's going to fill that void.
Self-publishing hasn't or has affected the short story because I mean it really has for novel well for people that write books, but short stories not the same effect, is it?
I don't think so. I mean, one of the things that you gain by publishing a story with one of the magazines or in an anthology or whatever is you gain their audience. You gain exposure to their audience. So even if you just sell one story to a magazine, it's worth the shot. If you don't sell it to any of the magazines, you can self-publish it. That's what's changed. So there's this sort of secondary opportunity for authors who really believe in a story that they're just not clicking with the market. But there might have readers out there. It's just hard for them to get discovered. Just like with the novels, it's just even worse for short fiction because there's so much of it.
Yeah, I think that discovery issue is, I mean, it's easy to publish, it's hard to get discovered. And
Mhm.
there's medium.com, there's Wattpad, there's different platforms like that. But how do we, if we love sci-fi, how do we know? We need this curated list, and I think that's where editors like you come in. And speaking of anthologies, you've got 8 of them. Do you mind talking a bit about your series of the best science fiction of the year series?
Uh, sure. So there's a history in the field of producing these, going back ages. I grew up reading best of the year anthologies, and actually, if somebody is looking to get a start on short stories, I recommend going to a year's best anthology always, because it gives you this wide range of what that editor thought was the best stories published in a year, across the entire market. And then when you're done reading that, you can go, oh, I like that story and that story and that story. Let's see where they were published. And if it's an anthology, you can go buy that anthology and find more stories that might appeal to you. If it was a magazine, then you might consider picking up an issue or subscribing to that magazine. So it's a great way to orient yourself. But so I look at my work on best science fiction of the year as sort of an intro to the field and also an historical standpoint of the field. Because if you look, so the best science fiction of the year series was Gardner Dozois. I think he sort of set the standard. It ran for over 30 years, and you can actually look at 30 years of history of our field by reading his introductions to those. So if you're really a short fiction junkie like myself, you can get into all of this and find out what's changing, what's happened, who the new authors were, what happened, what magazines came and went, any sort of big news that happened. So when Gardner passed away, I wanted to honor his tradition, and I incorporated some of what he covered in his introductions into mine so that that historical record wouldn't be broken. And it's not the same. It's my twist on it, but it's nice that I feel something of a responsibility, particularly as the only large best of the year anthology still going, to fill that gap. And it's a brutal project. I have to read everything everyone publishes that I can find. I'm sure to miss something, but like I said, 130 something magazines, maybe 50 or more anthologies, dozens of collections, on top of the thousands, 1,200 I'm reading for Clark's World. So I don't get to read many novels, as you might imagine.
How, just out of curiosity, how are you reading? Are you on a laptop? Are you, because they're not all always going to be converted to a digital format, right?
So a lot of them are ebooks, and I'm quite comfortable reading off a screen. Although I now I didn't have to use reading glasses when I started this job, and I do now. And some of the publishers send me those books in paper or those magazines in paper. I generally prefer the digital formats because I can take them anywhere I go. So if I'm at a convention or whatever, while I'm traveling, I can just catch up on the reading.
You know, hearing you talk about this, it's quite possible that there are not many people that have the amount of knowledge you have about science fiction short stories. And maybe that's an understatement. Have you ever considered doing some type of a history of science fiction short stories or changes or doing something that talks about that kind of evolving of short stories in science fiction?
Uh, yeah, I'm not a writer. Um, uh, so the writing is probably the part that slows me down the most. So I can assemble the anthology in faster than I can write the introduction for it. Uh, so the year's best now has gotten into a formula. I can pretty much, I know what research I have to do. I know what I just get everything down. But otherwise, if I have to actually think about, uh, framing an entire thing like that, it would be a lot different. I suppose in a couple of years, the 10th volume of Best Science Fiction will be out, and maybe someone will want a best of the last decade, in which case then I can talk about the decade in that kind of framework. Um, but I wouldn't want to have to uh, be responsible for. There's better people for some of the earlier decades. Let me put it that way. I've been working in this field for 18 years, so I'm good with the last 2 decades. Go back a little further, I'm not as precise. And there's some other editors who were working at the time that would probably be better suited to that.
When you're putting these together, Neil, do you look for, these best of the year anthologies? Do you look for sort of a breadth of subtopics? Like, are you looking for, one AI story, one alien story, one Mars colonization story, or is it just these are the best stories of the year?
Trying to be honest to the year, if the best stories of the year fell into a certain theme, now this is a 250,000 word anthology. It usually has about 30 stories in it. So if I end up publishing 4 of them that fit a theme, that you spread them out, it's not going to feel like that much because this is a brick of a book. Um, but it's also true to the year. If those themes were the ones that were getting people excited, that you want to convey some of that. So I think there's going to be a lean on some of the AI stories because it's just been so big.
And I guess that makes it kind of leads to another interesting question that I'm sure some of our listeners who are also writers would wonder about is if I'm looking at getting published in Clarke's World, you say a lot of climate, a lot of AI. Does that mean we don't submit them? Or I heard you say you need to have a different spin on it. Or
Mhm.
what's kind of the criteria that you're thinking there?
Okay, so when you're reading 1,000 stories a month, it's sort of like drinking from the fire hose. I tell people that volunteer to be slush readers with us that I want to see any story that sticks with them the next day because it all sort of blurs, and you need something that catches you, and usually it is something that made you think or something that made you feel. Like, do you care about the characters in this story? Do you care about what happens in this story? And everyone thinks that that's in their story, but they don't know what else is in the pile. Uh, and if there's 24 stories just like that, you're sort of going to get swept up in the sameness of it, and so telling someone to be distinctive is very difficult because they don't know what everybody else is doing. Uh, so one of the things I do recommend to authors, though, is that they volunteer to be a slush reader at a magazine they like. And that way they end up seeing all of that. And I also tell them to quit when you stop learning from that experience because no one should do it unless they have to. Um, but there's a couple of things that it gives you. One, it gives you that overview of what's going on in the field at the moment, what types of stories are hot, what types of mistakes are hot. Um, and it also gives you a sense, like I haven't met an author yet who doesn't have imposter syndrome. So everyone believes they're at one level, but they're actually a good few notches higher. And sometimes reading slush helps them realize that, get that confidence that they need to persist. The two common traits of authors we've published, uh, one, they persist, and two, they keep learning, they keep improving their craft. So this horrifies authors when I tell them this. So yeah. So authors, if you don't want to hear this, just skip ahead like 30 seconds. I read every story they've previously submitted before I send out their first contract. And that is not done to see whether or not I should accept this story. It's to see whether or not I made a mistake on one of the previous ones, because I believe that, if they're capable of selling me a story now, what was off about the last one? And what it's ended up showing me is this evolution in their skills. And it's the common trait amongst all of them. And you can see it now with some of the authors that might be that end up in the second round a lot, is that their skills are improving. But they still aren't quite there yet. But if you look back, you see, oh yeah, they're on the right trajectory. Anybody who gets to the second round of submissions at Clark's World, I generally expect to be able to sell us a story someday if they persist and keep learning.
How heavy-handed do you have to be as an editor in terms of modifications? I guess it depends, but
Mhm.
are you able to publish as is sometimes?
There's the rare author who gives you a perfect story.
Okay.
Everything's going to need proofreading,
Yeah.
and so you at least have that. Now, the only if a submission is perfect, it's probably AI.
Okay.
Yeah, at least spelling and grammar wise. Story wise, it's terrible. But yeah, somebody who's been writing a long time is capable of writing a story that very strong but most of the stories still require some work. Um, uh, you know, we've done several rounds of edits on some stories, and then a single proofreading pass on others because they were just in that shape. I would say that we generally do one or two rounds of edits on a story we publish.
Okay, I mean that seems quite reasonable to me. I mean, so that AI thing sounds like it's being a real thorn in your side. I suspect, I'm sorry to twist the knife in a wound here, but what's going on there? Are people submitting stuff saying it's their work and it's actually AI, or are they
Oh yeah.
disclosing that it's AI, or is it?
Oh, they aren't disclosing it's AI. No, they're
Okay.
perfectly content to lie.
Mm,
That is the one thing that they have in common. They all lie.
mhm.
We have it's in our submission guidelines that we don't want this at all. In 2023, we actually made international news by having to shut down because we were getting swarmed by these things. We reached a point, I think at our peak, one out of every two submissions was AI generated. And this was happening because there are side hustle gurus on the internet that were telling people, hey, you can make loads of money selling short fiction, um, and just generate it and blah, blah, blah. And I said what the per word rate that's nobody's going to get rich writing short fiction. But the problem is that that's a very American point of view, that there are places in the world that we've published stories by authors from those regions who we can pay an entire month's bills off of a short story sale.
Mhm.
So it is attractive when they do the math and they say, oh, we can make a few $1,000s off of this if we sell one at the longest rate. And so we had these people basically being scammed by a bunch of YouTube and TikTok and bloggers that were doing these side hustles, and we couldn't get them to stop. um, and when it wasn't working for them, we were rejecting and banning people left, right, and center, even the people who were making these videos.
Mm.
And the worst part was I consider these people victims just like us, because when they'd go back to those experts, uh, they would say it didn't work. And then they would say, well, I have this $250 video course that'll
Right.
tell you all of my secrets.
Mhm.
So just doubling down on the scam. And these were people that didn't have a lot of money to start with. So they were really disgusting, is the best way to describe them. And it's still a problem. Less so now. We were seeing new videos daily. A few of us were hit very heavily in the first round. It's spreading to some of the other magazines now, but we're always open to submissions. We've been around for 18 years, so we're more known and an easier target. And we've just had to get used to it. We had to close for a month to figure out what the heck we were doing. And the nice thing about that international news coverage was that people came out of the woodwork to try and help us. I even got calls from people inside some of these AI companies, apologizing for the idiocy of their management, for what, for the thing, for what they did and their role in the whole thing.
It actually all sounds like kind of a self-reflexive dystopian sci-fi novel in and of itself.
Oh yeah. Well, there isn't a billionaire that hasn't met a cautionary science fiction novel that they haven't gone, "Ooh, great idea." There's the joke that goes around on the internet, it's like the New York Times best-selling science fiction novel, um, don't build the torment nexus. And some billionaire goes, "I want to build the torment nexus." So, it's one of those things where, it, you have to sort of laugh. And it's one of the reasons we became this news story was, we were one of the first hit by AI, by the spamming element of it. And we were a science fiction magazine, and our logo is a robot. So they just loved that, here was the robots coming after the robot. So, it made a clever little story for them, but like I said, it brought out lots of experts who were able to tell us some things that we could do to prevent this from being too big of a problem, patterns we could find. My background's in computer science, so I wrote the submission software we use, so I started tweaking it to make it a little more manageable. We're doing better. We can actually stay open, which is, what I was concerned about because of that gateway aspect that I was saying about short fiction. When we publish new authors, that adds to the field. When any magazine publishes new authors, it adds to the field. If that suddenly became shut off because of a denial of service attack by AI, that would have long-term consequences.
And we've spoken to many authors that hate AI and they're worried about AI. And we've spoken to a few authors that are, nah, it's just a disruption of technology and it'll work itself out. Where are you?
I think that if uh, I don't believe it's going to get much better. In the last 2 years, I've seen the output of these things, and they're all bad. These are bad stories. You're not going to be replaced, at least not by anybody intelligent, with one of these tools. So if you're worried about somebody saying, "Oh, I'm just going to generate all my science fiction short stories for this magazine," they're going to go out of business because those stories are going to be terrible. And they probably had poor judgment to start with, so they weren't going to do you any good. The thing that's problematic is how it can gum up discovery. And that's not going to go away. What's going to have to happen is and it's already happening. While the quality of the AI writing has not gotten any better, or noticeably better over the last 2 years, despite all the major upgrades, what has gotten better is detection tools. When we first started dealing with this problem, everybody would advertise 98% accurate. And then we'd actually run our own tests and find out that it was more like 20% accurate. And it was inaccurate both in false positives and false negatives. So it was useless. Our own eyeballs were much more accurate. And now there's a few products out there that are actually 98% accurate. And you still have to use your own eyeballs to verify that you're not tripping over that 2%. But I think those are going to get better, and never perfect. I mean, our spam filters are still not perfect in our email. So I don't think it's going to be much different than that. It's then going to turn into this little war like we have with the virus and antivirus software. One's going to improve, the other one's going to have to improve.
Yeah, because there's problems with the false negatives, but those false positives can be harmful too. Talk about a kick in the pants for authors that say, "Hey, it's not AI. It's my writing. What's going on here? Is it just too clear or too derivative, maybe?"
It's certain words and phrases and things like that. I mean, it's trained off. It's a statistical model trained off the internet, so there's patterns in the human writing. It's hard because there's a lot of people who are really worried about this and worried sometimes for the wrong reasons and worried sometimes for the right. And I've had a lot of conversations with other editors because I've been on the front lines. I've been asked to speak to other publishers about things. I have like worst case scenarios that use to terrify people. If I wanted to scare everyone in publishing, I would give them my Amazon story. And here's my Amazon story.
Okay.
Amazon right now allows authors to self-publish. Um, I and small publishers like myself use that same interface. There's a checkbox. Is this AI generated or using AI? Yes, no. If you put yes, it doesn't do anything. If you put no, it doesn't do anything. All that data is saved by Amazon and not shared with the end user, because if you look at the product page, it never says whether or not it's AI. What are
Wow.
they doing with this? Amazon is a data-oriented company. They are trying to find out whether or not this stuff sells, because they don't need authors or publishers if they can do it all themselves. So the future product that I use to terrify authors and publishers is the new Kindle one button generate.
That is terrifying.
Yeah,
That is absolutely.
it's
So
it's
this is
science
where
fiction.
you request the story that you would like to hear.
Yeah. There's going to be people who are totally fine reading this very derivative, very flat writing it produces. I mean, you look at some of the bestsellers. They're not exact. Bestsellers can be quite bubblegum sometimes. They're not a work of literary genius. They're just comfort. It may reach the ability of doing, something comfortable enough for some people at some point.
If I can borrow a label that actually one of our previous guests, Cory Doctorow, has applied to all of this kind of stuff over the last little while, and that is the enshittification
Hmm.
of tech and industry and the world, and that just seems like a perfect example of it as well.
Oh yeah, yeah. He's absolutely on the nose with a lot of that. He and Ted Chiang are producing some interesting articles on the subject of AI and what this is going to lead to. I mean, the people I feel really bad for are my former colleagues in academia, because I can reject a story and not tell you I rejected it because I thought it was AI, which it's really bad. It doesn't matter whether or not it's AI, but a teacher can't. A teacher has to. So when you're reading submissions, you don't always finish them. It's like, nope, this isn't working for me. Like, I don't like zombie stories. So the minute a zombie shows up, it's like, boop, gone. Whereas if I were a teacher, I'd have to suffer through that.
Yeah, and
And
and determine if it actually is AI. And that's
and
that's what I
and
do, right? I'm a
and you
professor at a
can't.
college, and I can't. And that false positive issue that I talked about before, that's where it's really harmful. Where if a student says something that's quite more detailed than perhaps a student of that age would typically do, and I accuse them of being AI, that's harmful too, because that then they dumb down what they're writing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is very difficult.
Well,
Absolutely.
I used to deal with plagiarism cases.
Mhm.
So I used to do the data forensics on plagiarism cases to help prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that it was actually the person who submitted the paper that plagiarized it and all of that. Um, and they'd bring in lawyers.
Mm. Wow.
And so we could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they had plagiarized, and they'd still bring in a lawyer.
Mm.
Now they're going to bring in a lawyer, and I could know it's AI, but I could not prove it is AI.
Yeah, it's the proof that's the issue.
Yes.
Hmm.
Um, and yes, and there's a lot of people who falsely attribute bad writing to AI.
Hmm.
I've seen a few editors make comments where I'm like, no, what they are describing is an ESL person, somebody whose first language isn't English. Those are the types of mistakes they would make. Those are not mistakes an AI would make. And they are painting entire swaths of people by doing that. So it is very harmful in both false and positive.
I wanted to ask as well too, and knowing that you have a podcast as well too, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's it's a translation. It's a basically an audio book, if you will, of what you have published. Is that correct? Can you tell us a bit about how that works and what prompted you to go that route as well?
So one of my jobs as editor is to make sure that an author's story is read by the highest number of people it can be. Uh, and early on into publishing the magazine, podcasting was still fairly new. But we found out that some fiction podcasts were drawing in large audiences. So we decided that we would give it a try. And we started by just narrating, straight narration, not even the same reader every time. Our first podcasts don't even have introductions. They're really, really rough. But we decided that, the lead story from each issue would get podcast. And as it became more popular, we added more of the stories to it. Now we do all of them. And we have been doing all of them for several years now. I am not the narrator because, as I'm sure that your listeners are realizing, I am not the one that should be reading you a story. Kate Baker is our narrator, has been for many years now, probably the best hire I've ever made. uh, and she reads all of the stories each month. So as each story is a separate, or each podcast is a separate story from that month's issue.
It sounds like a great way to consume these as well, too. Again, it's like if you're driving home from work or on the train or whatever, it would be that nice quick bite of something to get you home. So
Mm-hmm.
that's really cool. And not that the books themselves aren't enough, but this is sort of these days it's the regular or the expected sort of evolution. But knowing that there are anthology series in media, television happening these days. Like I think about series like Love, Death, and Robots on Netflix, and the recent Secret Level on the streamer that shall not be named, and even Star Wars on Disney Plus. They have some animated anthology series. So I'm curious if that idea, because you're sitting on kind of a creative gold mine with the stories you've published. Has that ever come to pass? Has you ever been approached by a producer to do, some short film sci-fi anthologies?
So I get a lot of emails from people in Hollywood looking for short stories that they might consider optioning. We don't own the film rights on any of the stories we publish, so we connect, if they're interested in one, we connect them with the author or their agent. So actually one of our stories was in Love, Death, and Robots, the whale story, from I think it was maybe season 2.
Yeah.
That one was Ice by Rich Larson, and we've spoken to those guys a couple of times. Met them at the Nebula Awards one year, um, and a number of other companies have reached out to us. There's a film that's in progress of being made off of one of the stories we published.
Thinking about the aspiring writers out there, and we've talked a little bit about, form and content and that kind of thing, but if you were to give your, best pieces of advice to someone who wants to submit, what would be your submission tips? What would be your most valuable bits of advice for someone to have their best shot with you?
Write the story you're excited about wanting to write, not the one you think I will be. People who are, oh, I'm going to write a story for Clarkesworld. You're basing that on where I was several months ago, and I've probably moved. An editor's taste tends to be a bit of a moving target. So you have to sort of be the thing I want to go to next, rather than replicate what I've done before. I can tell when somebody is writing to market. And you can sometimes tell when somebody's following their own thing. Read the guidelines. I mean, the guideline we have in our guidelines have a laundry list of the things I don't want to see, because that's better advice than what I want to see. And if I told people what I wanted to see, that's all I'd get. And then I'd be bored. and I'd reject all of them, and everyone would think I was a liar and all that. So it would not be a productive thing. But telling people what we don't want to see is actually useful. So checking that out. I mentioned being a slush reader somewhere. If someone has the time and the opportunity, it's a great way to learn a lot of really useful skills. And if somebody out there wants to be an editor, I recommend it even more, because you're going to find out what it's like rather than the idealized version you have. I did not do that going in. I went, basically how I started editing was Thursday night, I was driving to a convention. Friday night, I was editing a magazine. I had no intention of starting a magazine. I was talked into it by a friend. And I'm glad he did, because I ended up discovering a career I love. But it's not going to work that way for everybody. You're going to have to find your own path, and just keep writing. Remember, rejection is part of the field. The majority of people who submit stories to us jump out after one. And you like the lottery, you have to be in it to win it. And you just keep trying. Don't take the rejection personally. I have rejected stories that have won major awards, and they won major awards because they landed where they were supposed to. So yes, don't give up hope. It's important.
Thank you for joining us today. We very much appreciate you. Thank you, Neil, for joining us. That was awesome. We hope to chat again soon. Join us next time. More great conversations on Tales from the Bridge. Until next time.